Good evening, everyone. Sorry about the slightly late start. My name is Jamie Besance. I'm the Visitor Engagement Coordinator at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. Tonight's program is Where the Birds Never Sing. Author Jack Sako is going to tell us about his book by the same name. Safety is a top priority, so all of our programming is online right now. But Soldiers Memorial and the Missouri History Museum are open Wednesday through Sunday with safety precautions in place, and we'd love for you to visit if you feel safe. We recommend that you make advance reservations online because we're at reduced capacity right now. You can do so at mohistory.org. Before we get started, I just have a few logistical points. This is a roughly 30-minute presentation followed by 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. You can submit your questions through the Q&A box on your toolbar. We'll do our best, but we might not be able to get to everybody's questions depending on how many we get. Today's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to see it again or if you want to show it to someone else after it's over, it should be posted to the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel in just a few days. Also, when you close out the webinar, there should a survey should open in your web browser. We'd appreciate your feedback if you'd take a few minutes to respond to the survey. I also want to thank the Missouri Historical Society members for their support, as well as the Soldiers Memorial Giving Circle. You make programs like this possible. So with that, Mr. Sako, are you ready?
I'm here. Can you see me?
No, your video is not on yet. I see a
Let's
nice
see.
picture of you.
Okay, let's see. How about that?
There you are, looking good.
Thank you.
All right. Jack Sako, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And please, if you can, please support the Missouri Historical Society and the museum. I hear they're taking reservations, and you can visit. I think it's very important to visit because we as a nation, our military is our family, not only nationally but individually. And we can see our history and touch our history and get to know the people who've come before us and the people now who are defending our country. I love our military, and one of the reasons is because of my own family. My brother was in the army. Both of my grandfathers were in World War I. They were immigrants from Italy, and uh, my father was in World War II. And these, in all of our families, are our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our grandfathers, um, and many in it, and I know in talking to my father's buddies, many people from World War II, and I guess people who've experienced combat, oftentimes don't speak about it. They don't talk about all of the things that they went through. They might mention a few things now and then, but I've heard from so many people who tell me that their fathers, grandfathers, uncles never talked about the war, never talked about things that happened there. My father always did talk to me about it for some reason. I asked him once, well, why did you always talk to me since the time I was a little kid? And his response was, he said, I never really talked to anybody else, but I talked to you because you wouldn't stop asking me questions. So, so it worked out for me because I loved hearing the stories. And I want to show you some of the things he used to show me. I'm going to show you some of his medals and awards in just a minute, but I want to show you some of the other things that he would share with me as a little kid, which was incredibly fascinating. One was this sword. Uh, I'm going to take it out here. Let's see. Kind of incredible. It's a Nazi sword that he had picked up in Germany at a officer's house at the end of the war, and so we still have this, and we have a couple of swords. Let's see if I can put this down without stabbing myself. Another thing that he had that I think is incredible, kind of a museum piece, is this dagger. And I'm going to hold this up so you could see. It has the swastika on it, so it's kind of, it was always like, at one time, I remember this was very scary as a kid, very intriguing, but also very scary to see that swastika. But this was, belonged to a German um, officer, and my father found it and brought it home. So we still we still have it, and many other things. A lot of the guys who were in the war had never been away from home. They were not what we think of necessarily. When we think about soldiers, they were teachers, they were school teachers. Like I say, they were worked on a farm like my father. They were everyday guys who were called in to fight this battle. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share the screen here and show you some photographs that that my father uh, shared with me, and also that I want you to be able to see. This is. Let me see if I can do this without completely logging myself off. Okay, how about that? Now, my this is obviously the book that I wrote about my father's experiences during World War II. I wrote it in the first person because to me it was more powerful to hear from him how he experienced it. All of history, if you think about history, it's some of our it should be our greatest stories in our country's lives in the world. And oftentimes we are taught history from a perspective of dates, times, and historical events, and it loses the emotion. And in fact, every one of the historical events that has ever happened there's been great human emotion surrounding it. And so I wanted to capture that emotion of my father and his story. And wanted people to understand how it felt, not only for him, but how it felt for me to hear these stories. These are the photographs. This is a photograph of the medals and awards that he won. There's a cross. Obviously, you see that wasn't part of his uniform, but he was an Italian Catholic. Like I say, his parents had come from Sicily, and his faith and family were very important to him. His grandfather had given him that cross before he left, and told him to always keep it with him, that God would keep him safe. My father was very, scared to leave home. Like I say, he had never been away from home. The first beach he ever saw was Omaha Beach. So he kept that cross. Interesting little side note about that cross. It actually originally came from the University of Notre Dame. My father didn't go to college. Nobody in the family had ever gone to college, but it turned out that's where I went to college, to Notre Dame. So that's not only special because my father kept it, but it was special because that's the place it came from. A priest there. You'll notice a few things on this photograph. One is there's an A inside a red circle. That's the insignia of the Third Army, led by General Patton. There's also a combat infantry badge. You might notice there, Operation Overlord, the Normandy Invasion Medal, Victory in Europe Medal, World War II Victory Medal, U.S. Army Good Conduct Medal. Father had good conduct, that's good. European campaign with 5 Bronze Stars, the D-Day Medal, the German Army of Occupation Medal, Battle of the Bulge Medal, and including the French Croix de Guerre. So these are beautiful to display, but also just very emotional to know that my father had these medals, and this is what he shared with me. You can even see his dog tags on there. I'm actually wearing one of the insignias from his uniform on my lapel. This is my father with his parents. Actually, a few days before he received his draft notice, he just turned 18. He was in Birmingham, Alabama. His father there was had come from Italy, like both of his parents did. They'd gone to Ellis Island and then on to Chicago. Just a one little quick side note on my grandfather there. He grew up in Sicily. One of his best friends in Sicily wanted to recruit him to be in Al Capone's gang, and my grandfather said no, and he had a little run in with Al Capone, believe it or not. And the guy who tried to recruit my grandfather, who was his childhood friend, ended up being one of the shooters in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So my grandfather didn't want to have anything to do with that business. So he went to Alabama, which is where my father was born, and which is where I was born. So this is them just before my father was drafted. And by the way, these guys, in World War II, they came out of the Depression, and then they went off and won the war, saved the world really, and then came back and built this country. So you have to have great respect. That's why they're called the greatest generation. This is my father on the first day he was in the army. He had this picture. I always thought it was funny because I said, what happened? How'd you come about taking this picture? He said, well, they put my uniform on me, they shaved my head, they put the hat on me, and they said, go stand in front of that flag. And I did it. And they took a picture and gave me the picture. So I always thought it looked like Gomer Pyle in this. And he does. So we'll circle back to this picture a little later to have a comparison between the beginning of the war and the end of the war. Um, my father and his buddies, they went off, they shipped out in 1944 and ended up, they went to England, then they went to Northern Ireland. This picture is taken in Lurgan, Northern Ireland, the 92nd Signal Battalion. The Signal Battalion, and my father actually tagged himself in this before you could actually tag yourself in something. He actually just put an arrow to where he was in the picture. So that's him in the background. And the Signal Battalion was an interesting group because they weren't technically a combat battalion, but they were in combat all the time because they were with or in front of the infantry at all times. So they had to learn, they had to be ready for combat all the time, and they saw combat because they were at the front lines continuously. So and sometimes behind enemy lines in order to string the phone lines to communication so that people could hear. One of the people, my father went to England right before D-Day, was outside of Oxford, England, and this gentleman came and spoke to them. His name is General George S. Patton. And many of you, I assume, have seen the movie Patton. At the beginning, George C. Scott gets up and gives a talk about a speech to the troops. In the movie, he's just standing in front of a flag, and it's very quiet. It's just him giving the speech. In real life, my father was there. His buddies were there. They gave me their accounts of what happened and what it sounded like. The George Patton Society actually gave me a transcript of word for word of what Patton really did said. And just let me say this: in the movie, they cleaned it up. So, and in the book, I actually have the real speech, the actual speech that George Patton gave that day. And another thing is that the troops, including my father and his buddies, who were pretty much right in the front of what, to see what was going on, they were just going crazy. They were clapping, they were cheering. They loved this guy. He was their, their Newt Rockney, if you will. He was the guy who was going to lead them into battle, and they loved him. And there are a lot of stories about Patton coming up because Patton would come up and talk to the guys at the front lines. Like I said, the first beach my father ever saw was Omaha Beach. He didn't see a beach. He was working on a farm in Birmingham, Alabama, so he didn't have time to go to the beach, take a vacation. Um, um, but and this wasn't exactly a vacation, as you can see from the photograph. My father would say that he felt he was 19 when he landed at Omaha Beach, and he felt like he was 35 by the time they got to the top. Here they are in France. My father's in the foreground here. He's got a friend named Silverman there in the photograph with him, and they're stringing up the phone lines. And this is what they would do. Remember, I told you they were with the infantry. And so a lot of times the infantry would be just beneath them. I mean, they would be on the ground. And in one particular case, it was similar to this. It wasn't when this photograph was taken, but they would use telephone poles, but also trees, whatever they had available. And in one particular case, there's a story that the guys told me. My father and his buddies, whom I got to know very well, they told me that they were stringing the phone lines and they were up in the trees. The infantry was down below, and the infantry guys were, getting ready. And they told them, they said, "Hey guys, you need to get down out of those trees. You're giving our location away." And because they knew the Germans weren't far away, and my father and his buddies, they were saying, "This is our job. We have to be up here. We're not afraid." And so the infantry guys kept telling them, "Get down, man. You're giving, the Germans are going to know right where we are." And pretty soon they saw a Jeep come up to the front lines, and it was flying, it was speeding, and it came to a screeching halt. And out stepped, had stars on the flag, and out of the Jeep stepped General Patton. He looked up at my father and his buddies, and he looked down at the infantry who were on the ground, and he said, "Hey, soldier." He talking to the guys up in the trees. He said, "Hey, soldier." My father and his buddies, actually it was Silverman there, said, "Yes, sir, General." He said, "What are you doing up there, soldier?" He said, "Sir, we're stringing the phone lines, sir, stringing up the phone lines." And Patton said, He looked around. He said, "Let me ask you something, soldier. From where you are, can you see the enemy?" My father and his buddies looked out into the distance, and one of them said, "Yes, sir, we could see them. They're right over that. They're right over that. Yeah, we can see them. They're right over there." And Patton said, "Don't they make you nervous?" And Silverman said, "No, sir, they don't, but you do." So Patton loved that. He jumped back in the car and in the Jeep, and the Jeep sped off. And he said, "Ah, these these Center Battalion guys are crazy." He loved that, and they loved him. They loved him in return. This is just a couple of photographs, three photographs. You can see my father up in the top left, reading a letter from home. Letters from home were golden. It was like a treasure, and he'd read them over and over and over. This is him in the middle with some of his friends, and down at the bottom, I think that, yeah, that's a picture of in France, just relaxing if you could during a war. He told me it was just a non-ending noise, non-ending battle. One of the things about my father, and anybody who ever met him knew this quite well, especially his own children, is he was a very gentle man, very gentle. He he lived gently. He spoke gently. And to tell you the truth, he even died gently. I was with him. My whole family was with him. I guess the one thing he didn't do gently was fight Nazis, because they took care of business when they were over there. But one of the things that my father uh, did is that um, he told me about how they looked after the children there. Um, I'm going to read to you just a little section from the book itself, where my father said, and I like I say, I wrote it in the first person as if he's telling it. So he says, thank God for the American soldier. We did our best to look out for the little children. Whenever we would see them watching us in the chow line, we would each get a kid, put him or her in front of us, and give the child half of our mess kit. Captain told us we weren't supposed to do that because there might not be enough food for the rest of us. But we didn't care. We loved these kids. They had gone through hell and they had done nothing. Uh, and they had nothing to do with the war. They had done nothing wrong. It made all the guys feel good to see these kids eat, to do something kind and gentle, in contrast to the chaotic inhumanity surrounding us. I know it made me happy, and I believe it made God happy, me watching over the children while he watched over me. So I told you that my father had shown me the medals and the swords and daggers and all those things from the war. But one day when I was 12, he showed me this. If you can see my picture up in the corner here, he showed me this album, the photo album, and he said, "I'm going to show you something that happened during the war." My mother was actually sitting in the room with him, and usually she wasn't there when we talked war stories, but she was there that day. And he said, "I'm going to show you something that happened during the war." I assumed it was going to be something exciting, another medal or something like that, perhaps another sword. That would be great. And he said, "No, this is something that happened at a concentration camp. We took pictures." And I honestly didn't know what a concentration camp was at that time. As I said, I was 12. And he said, I said, what is it? What's a concentration camp? He said, "Well, the Nazis were killing people there, but we made them stop." And he said, "I'm going to show you these for two reasons. The first is that I want you to know that this really did happen. There are going to be people in your life that are going to tell you that the Holocaust didn't happen." He said, "It did happen. I was there. I saw it. It happened." And he said, I want you to make sure that this never happens again." I said, "Okay, okay." I really didn't know what was about to happen or what he was going to show me. So he showed me these pictures. I'm not gonna show them on the screen because they're horrendous, um, and I want to be respectful of the audience, especially if there are children there or young people. They are in my book. Some of them are. They had never been published. They'd been sitting in my father's belongings in his drawer for years and years and years. And they were pictures of what he saw when he entered the camp. They had found some cameras and film a couple of days before in a German truck. They had taken them, and when they walked into the camp, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. These are men who had been at Omaha Beach, who had been through the Battle of the Bulge, who had seen entire cities get destroyed, who had seen their own friends die in their arms. And yet they had never seen anything like what they saw on Sunday, April 29th, 1945, in that concentration camp. Was at the very end of the war, and they were shocked. It was at the inhumanity that they saw. The first thing they saw was obviously the gate. They didn't know what it was. My father said he and his buddies didn't know what it was. They came upon it. They were told that they were going to capture it. The gun battle only lasted about 20 minutes. It was not a difficult place to take over. It was big. It was a very big place. but they assumed they knew it was some type of prison, but they thought maybe it was prisoners of war or something like that, were in it. But they all they knew was they were going to fight. They were going to. The infantry went over. My father and his buddies um, got up right next to the walls when the infantry had defeated the Nazis that were left inside, and most of the real regular, if you will, Nazis had run off and gone away. The SS troops, who were like the insane version of their military, who would kill uh, at a moment's notice. They were killing machines basically, and but they stayed behind because they wanted to kill all of the prisoners in the concentration camp. Arbeit macht frei. I don't know that I'm pronouncing that correctly, but basically it means work will make you free. Um, just do what you're told, and you'll be okay. This was the motto. They went inside and they were shocked at what they saw. Uh, I'm going to and obviously in the book there's a very clear description of what my father and his buddies saw and how it made them feel. Um, these photographs, a couple of them are just some of the prisoners, and they look like the Walking Dead. I'm going to quote for you a passage from the book. I thought it was interesting. My father said it was very quiet when they first walked in. He said the prisoners had apparently not understood what was happening during the first 30 minutes or so after we took over the camp. Now they were beginning to realize that we were the good guys and that they had been liberated. Some of them began yelling and shouting. The cheers of the few soon grew to become a deafening roar throughout the camp. These are the ones we saved, I thought as chills ran through my body. They were crowding together, reaching through the fences, wanting to touch us. They looked like the walking dead, like they were too frail to stand or reach or even smile. Yet in their parched voices, we heard jubilation, and in their sunken eyes, we saw the joyful glimmers of resurrected hope. They were laughing, crying, singing, holding their arms high in the air, embracing each other while looking at us in disbelief, almost unable to grasp that their day of liberation, their exodus, was at hand. Just then, just then, as if on some celestial cue, the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light and color over the entire camp. Darkness had been defeated by light, and the prisoners, squinting into that brilliance, reached out to us and wept tears of joy. Their agony was over. But for us, the liberators, our journey into this deepest part of hell was just beginning. My father and his buddies then walked around in the camp and witnessed things that they could have never imagined. Death on a scale, on a magnitude that was unimaginable for these hardened combat veterans. Soldiers were crying. Um, some were throwing up. They couldn't fathom what they were seeing. Old people, elderly, young people, children, babies, dead everywhere. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands. There were rail cars, as you could see here, photograph taken by one of my father's buddies. My father climbed up. It was some of them were cattle cars. He climbed up. They were looking for life inside. Bodies were in there, all strewn about, packed into these rail cars, all dead. My father said that he noticed in the corner of one of them, um, looking down into it, he noticed a lady nursing a baby. I asked him how old was the lady. He said she was probably about 22, 23. My father was 20, had just turned 20 at this point. So he said she was probably in her early 20s. She was nursing a baby. Both of them were dead. To my father, like I said, being raised Italian Catholic, to him, that was a symbolic of the Madonna and Child, the ultimate symbol of life and hope. And he felt like she had been telling her baby, if you could just hold on for a few hours, just hold on, the Americans are coming, they're going to save us. And she was giving the baby the last drop of life. And he said, we didn't get there in time. He told me that his hands started to shake and he felt himself crying, and he climbed down off of it, and he couldn't control his tears. And he said that he prayed that God would forgive him for not getting there sooner, so that he could have saved that lady and her baby. He told me that he knew no matter how long he lived, that he would never see anything so tragic. I did an article, I wrote an article for USA Today magazine a few months ago, and they chose the cover, the cover photograph. I had never seen this photograph, but uh, in this in this photograph, down in the corner, in the left corner, was a picture of my father. And I'll zoom in on it a little bit so you can see it. My father with the, is just exactly the way he looked at the other ones and the way he always looked. And he had that cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and he was looking at at the prisoners, like just as he did describe, reaching through the fences, reaching out to the American soldiers. And knowing him, I know that the look on his face, it looks like he's about to cry in this picture at what he's seeing. And so, like I said, I had never seen this picture before, but it was him. It is him, and we have multiple other pictures of him at the camp. But this one I thought was very interesting because I had never seen it before, and because USA Today used it as their photograph, and they didn't know that was my father. The soldiers stayed overnight. My father and his buddies stayed overnight. Once again, there's an account of it in the book. The next morning, they left. Eisenhower had come and marched. They had walked all the villagers through the camp so that the villagers, the townspeople of Dachau could see what's going on inside the camp. My father said some of them were crying, some of them were walking straight face through it, as if they didn't want to look around, but they wanted to make sure. And in fact, one of my father's buddies said, "You know what? Every American should walk through this place to see it." And my father and his buddies fortunately had taken photographs so that they would have documentation of it. Uh, they left the next morning, and my father told me this. He said, "We left Dachau later that morning. This was on the 26th, the Monday morning." He said, "Having assisted the relief organizations in their efforts to bring some semblance of humanity back to this place that had endured so much tragedy and sorrow. Our hearts were burdened by what we had seen, but somehow lifted by the passionate gratitude of the liberated, who had blessed us with their joy and rewarded us with unexpected insights into what we had achieved. Now, after a year of combat, each of us finally and forever understood why destiny had called us to travel so far from the land of our birth and to fight for people we did not know. And so it was here, in this place abandoned by God and accursed by men, that we came to discover the meaning of our mission." A powerful sentiment that at Dachau, they came to understand why they had left their homes, uh, why they had gone to fight. Because there were times during the war where, honestly, they told me that some of these World War II soldiers, like, they would say, we didn't really understand what was going on, and they really didn't understand what was happening in all the battles. These were the communication guys, and they were in charge of telling other people and allowing the other branches of the military, the other parts of the army, know what was happening. But there were times when they did question, why are we here? Why are we fighting? And when they walked into Dachau and they liberated, they very personally understood why they were there. This is my father. And once again, if you look at this picture, this is in Germany. I think this was either a few days before, a few days after the liberation. And once again, he has a cigarette. All of these guys smoke. My father didn't smoke before he went into the army, but he started smoking there, and he smoked for a long time afterwards, till my mother made him stop. This photograph was taken a week after the liberation of Dachau. It was taken in Salzburg, Austria. My father and his buddies moved on out of Dachau and went down to Salzburg, and he said he saw a photography studio, walked in, put on his Class A uniform, walked in, and said that he wanted to take a picture for his mother and send it home. And I asked him, I said, how many photographs did the man take? He said he took one. I gave him 50 cents. He took the picture. A couple of days later, I went back, picked the picture up, and sent it to my mother. Now I have the original photograph, but I told him, just having worked in Los Angeles and Hollywood for a long time, I said, there are actors and models who would pay thousands of dollars and no telling how many rolls of film to get one picture that looked like that. And um, but that's just the way he looked. And just an interesting side note, my father came out to Los Angeles once. He had the book with him. In this book, pictures on the cover, and there were girls, there were actresses, they were crowding around my father's, because why not? They always crowded around my father. Even when I was in high school, the girls always crowded around my father, and to talk to him and to sort of get his attention. But he loved it, and my mother loved it too. But the girls asked my father. They said, out in Los Angeles, the actresses, they said, "Mr. Sacco, who do you think should play you in a movie?" And they were pointing to this picture. And my father looked at the picture. He said, "I don't know who could play me in a movie, but whoever it is, he better be good looking." So I agree. Now, this is the picture I told you I'd come back to. This is the picture of in the first day. He was in the Army. So you see the difference. This is a year and a half, maybe 2 years difference here. Big difference. He went from Gomer Pyle to being a Hollywood leading man, overnight, or within a couple of years. But there's something really serious about this picture and beautiful about it. And this really encompasses who my father was. This is a photograph of my father 60 years after the liberation with um, a gentleman named Max Steinmetz. And Max was a prisoner at Dachau. And so they had the opportunity to be reunited and and be together, and they became friends. And my father, as he went with me around the country, he was able to meet many people who were liberated, and I have as well. And it's such a great honor to meet them. My father always still felt protective of them. He would ask if they're okay. I tend to do the same thing when people come to me and they say my grandparents were in the camp, or I was in the camp, or my father was there. I tend to immediately want to ask them if they're okay and if they need it, if they need anything. And I think it's almost genetic. Is that I love the fact that my father helped and liberated that camp, and the Holocaust ended the moment these soldiers got there. It ended that moment, and I was always proud of that. And I love the people who lived and have gone on and created great lives and contributed greatly to this world. This is a photograph of me several years ago, obviously, with a gentleman named, and he was an ambassador from Austria to the Vatican. His name is Georg von Hohenberg, an incredible man. Ambassador Hohenberg's grandfather was the Archduke Ferdinand, which, as you know, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914 to begin World War One. I got to know him. I went to Austria and gave a talk, not about the book, but about a completely different subject. He was there. I spent a week with him and other members of the different royal families, including the Liechtensteins, the Luxembourgs, and the Habsburgs. Well, Ambassador Hohenberg, he had told me originally, he said, "Chris, just call me Georg." I couldn't call him Georg because his grandfather had been the Archduke Ferdinand. I couldn't just call this man Georg. So I called him Mr. Ambassador. He was incredibly pleasant to me. We talked about his grandfather and his grandmother being assassinated. When you're around somebody who is directly connected with history like this, or at least when I am, I just pepper them with questions, and I want to know everything that they. I mean, he was telling me stuff about Rasputin and all these characters through history that his family had come in contact with. At the very end of the week that I spent there, I was actually in a castle because that's where they live, and I was staying with them. I was sitting there and I thought, I've asked the ambassador all these questions for a week about his grandparents, just constantly. And he put up with me. And I thought, I said, "Mr. Ambassador," we were sitting around having tea, the Contessa, the Prince, the Princess, and me, the grandson of peasants from Sicily. And so I said, "Mr. Ambassador, you have been very cordial and you've been very patient with me as I've asked you questions all week about your grandparents." I said, "But let me ask you something. What Tell me something about your father." And I don't know what made me ask the question, but I was curious about his father because I'd never asked anything about his father. And he said, of all the things he could have told me about his father's life, he said the following. He said, "During World War II, my father was a political prisoner at the concentration camp at Dachau. And he told me, he said, the Princess Margareta Luxemburg, who was sitting there, he said her grandparents were also prisoners there. And I said, Mr. Ambassador, do you know much about the liberation of the concentration camp? He said, Sunday morning, April 29th, 1945. I said, well, there were about 200 American soldiers who liberated that camp. And he said, I'm well aware of that. I said, well, my father was one of them. And when I said that, he stood up. He was wearing his three-piece suit. As a matter of fact, he wasn't, this one he's wearing a three-piece suit, but this is his leisure suit. This is, we were out hiking this day. Look at, this is his hiking attire, and you can see mine. So not exactly wearing the royal garb. I'm not, but he is. But anyway, this particular day, he's wearing his really nice three-piece suit. And when I said my father was one of the liberators, he stood up. And when he stood up, Princess Margareta of Luxembourg stood up. She's a wonderful person. Her husband, Prince Nicholas von Liechtenstein, stood up. The Contessa stood up. Everybody stood up. I didn't know what to do, so I stood up. When I stood up, he walked across to me. He embraced me, and he said into my ear, "Please convey to your father my family's most sincere gratitude." So it was in that moment that I realized what a big story this was, and how my father had participated in something monumental. I Years later, I decided to write a book about my father's experiences during the war, and not just not just simply the liberation of the camp, but my father's experiences himself, because he was a farm boy who went off and and it was had a front row seat to all the greatest battles of World War II, and then ended up liberating a concentration camp, took photographs. My father and his buddies, still 60, 70, whatever years later, would tear up when they talked about the liberation, not the other things, but when they talked about the liberation of the camp. So I wanted to tell the journey of these American soldiers, and what it was like for them, and convey the emotions. And also there was a very nice love story involved. Not going to give away too much of that. You have to read that yourself. But it involved a French girl, I'll say that. And um, that's all in the book. And my mother insisted that that be in the book. So it is in the book. And I decided to write a book. I contacted agents, and they said you need a literary agent. I'd never written a book. I'd read a book, but I figured, how hard could it be to write one? Well, it ends up being very difficult to write a book. But I thought, I'm going to write a book, but I don't know anybody in the publishing world. I don't have an agent. And people told me, you need an agent. In order to write a book, you need an agent to get it published. I went to different agents, and I told them the story about the ambassador and his father being in the concentration camp, and about all the things that my father had been through. And every agent I talked to, every literary agent I talked to, said, we've heard all the stories about World War II. We've heard it all. I said, you haven't heard this story. This story is very unique. This story is very different, and it's going to be told in a different way, and it encompasses different things. And my father was there. He witnessed everything. And it tells the story of the liberators. We never hear about the liberators and how the liberation of the concentration camps, and they're bearing witness to the truth of the Holocaust, but we never hear about what it was like for them to do that and how it affected their lives after. So I think this story needs to be told. In any event, none of the agents would even talk to me, and the ones who did say, nobody's going to publish your book and nobody's going to read your book. And so I decided to go in a different direction. I actually just contacted HarperCollins myself through a friend, and who had published with them. And he was so kind as to give them a portion of my manuscript, a few chapters that I'd written. And I got a call from HarperCollins a few days later, and they said, "This is a remarkable story. It's a very different story than anything we've ever heard. have you finished the book? I said, no, I've not finished it. They said, what's it going to take for you to finish this book? I said, a contract. He said, we'll call you in 10 days. And so 10 days later, they called me. They sent me a contract. I wrote the book. It was published by HarperCollins. It went to the top of bestsellers lists. It was, won some awards, and continues to jump up occasionally to number one on Amazon. So the lesson there is never ask for permission to succeed. Just like my father and his buddies at Omaha Beach didn't ask for permission when they liberated the concentration camp. They didn't ask anybody's permission. They did it because it was the right thing to do. So this is my father with the book. He loved the book. He loved talking about the book. He loved telling people about the book. And like I said, he wanted somebody very handsome to play him in the movie. And we're working on the movie now. At the end of the war, my father had, I mentioned he had been afraid to leave home. He told me that he was actually more scared, more afraid to come home because he had experienced so much. He didn't think anybody would ever be able to understand what he experienced and how he felt and how it felt. He told me that he took that cross, that crucifix that his grandfather had given him, and he held it to his chest as the train pulled into Birmingham, Alabama. And he said he thanked God for seeing him physically safely through the war, but now he prayed that the heartaches would heal. General Patton said something, and I quote him in the book a lot. And he said this about the men, my father and the other men of the Third Army. This is a quote from General George Patton. He said, "By God, I'm proud of these men. To me, it's a never-ending marvel what our soldiers can do. This war has made a higher demands of courage and discipline than any war of which I've known. But when you see men who have demonstrated courage and discipline, and they are killed or wounded, it naturally raises a lump in your throat and sometimes produces a tear in your eye. Back of us stretches a line of men whose acts of valor, of self-sacrifice, and of service have been the theme of song and story since before recorded history began. These are your fathers and grandfathers. These are the victors of war." And so with that, I would like to thank you for joining me. I'm going to come out of this and would like to turn it back over to Jamie, and maybe we have some questions. Anything that you have, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as a reminder, it'll be easier for me to access the questions if you put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, as opposed to the chat. We actually don't have any audience questions just yet, but we do have a couple nice comments from one attendee who says that you look a lot like your father and you have a lot to be proud of.
Thank you.
And they recommend
Appreciate
Kirk Douglas for the movie.
Kirk, he's a little old, and I think he's dead, but is he dead? Is he alive?
I'm not sure.
But assuming he's alive, then he might be a little older than 19. But I like where you're going with that. I like where you're going with the Kirk Douglas. Jamie, you might have to help me. How do I get out of this sharing?
Oh, if you hit the share screen button again down at the bottom, that should stop the sharing.
Okay.
While we wait for audience questions as they come in, one question that I had listening to your father's story was,
Is
you
that
mentioned,
it? Did I do it?
You got it. Yeah, you
Okay,
got
good.
it.
Thank you. Thank you. All these newfangled technical
Right.
things. Trying to keep up with you kids.
You mentioned the meaning making around the war, and the Holocaust, of course, has become a huge part of the meaning that we make of World War II.
Yes.
And so I suppose it's kind of a dual question. One is, it sounded like your father and the people he served with at first didn't have a very clear sense of what they were fighting for. Did he ever mention whether superiors said anything about, like, well, we're containing German aggression, or whether there was or you're fighting for your country? Kind of what was the messaging there? And then the other piece of my question, I guess, is how my understanding is that before the end of the Holocaust, and even before the war, that people outside of Germany were somewhat aware of what was happening, but that maybe people didn't know the full extent of it. Do you
Right.
know whether your father knew anything about what was happening, or whether it was just kind of all um, on
Yeah.
seeing Dachau?
Yeah, you have to remember that they didn't have the communications then that we do now, and so there wasn't this plethora of information or opinions going back and
Right.
forth. This was this is a cliche to say this, but it was a simpler time, and they they knew that there was a war. They knew. My father told me when he heard about Pearl Harbor being bombed. He had never heard of Pearl Harbor. He didn't know where that was. He'd never heard that name, Pearl
Right.
Harbor. And so when they knew about Hitler, they knew there was a war brewing. They could see the newsreels and the newspapers and that type of thing. But they also knew that they served their country. And so when it was time to go to war, like I say, he didn't want to go, but he went because he was drafted. And that's what you did. His parents had come over and they loved this country. He loved this country, and he would do anything to defend this country. And so that's they were going to war to defend the country. Now he told me that when they were in Germany, there were times when they would be exhausted, and one of the guys would ask them the other like, "Why are we even here? Hitler didn't attack us. The Japanese attacked us, Pearl Harbor, but they didn't attack us." And they would have those types of moments, and I document them in the book because it's part of the emotional arc. There was a time when one of his buddies was talking to him toward the end of the war, and he said, "Joe, you ever notice we've seen our friends die?" Yeah, he said, and we've seen the enemy die. We've seen the Germans die. He said, yeah. He said, do you ever notice that none of our people and none of the Germans ever ask at the end of their life, ask for the president. They don't ask for Roosevelt. They don't ask for Hitler. They ask for their mama. He said they all want their mama, So these were boys and who had become men in a hurry, and they didn't know what a war was. I mean, they had never witnessed violence. We have kids now. Everybody's seen violence. They show it on television all the time, real violence. But back then there wasn't. Even in the movies, it was you could fight and then they'd bang bang. There wouldn't even be any blood. So it was a whole different way of reality when they landed at Omaha Beach, and then they saw this is real and this is final, and so it on one hand it scared them, and on the other hand they had to constantly be on guard and keep their wits about them and naturally there would be times when they wondered why are we here, but when they walked into Dachau, every one of them knew this is why we were here, to save people. And in that respect, they were sort of blessed more than other soldiers who didn't get to see that. They were blessed. They saw the people they saved. And they didn't see it, but they saved us too. And they saved all of our way of life.
Yeah, from from my perspective, looking back now, like we've said, the Holocaust has become such a huge part of the meaning that we make of World War II that it's almost hard for me to understand that wasn't why Americans went to Europe in the first place. They didn't
Right.
hear that the Holocaust was happening and say, "Oh well, we've got to put a stop to this." That wasn't
No, no, there
the
were bigger,
geopolitics of the
there were
situation.
big things going on, and they
Right.
they went there. And like I said, my father, and maybe people have said to me, well, some of the American diplomats and politicians knew about the concentration camps. Maybe they did. My father didn't know. The liberators, when they got there, they had no idea what it was, and that was one of the reasons it shocked them so bad. They had
Right.
never. My father said, "You want to fight?" Talking to the German, "You want to fight somebody? Fight me. I'm a soldier. Fight me. You don't fight children and the elderly and babies. What did they do to you?" So it showed the true evil of what was happening there, and so it wasn't the political reason, I suppose, that we went there, but it ended up being one of the big
Right.
reasons, that we were there.
Right.
And
We have an audience question, a couple
Yes.
questions. How did you arrive at the title of your book?
The title, Where the Birds Never Sing. I had been to Dachau several years earlier before I wrote the book. And I had noticed, and many of you maybe have been to the Dachau or one of the other Auschwitz or some of the other concentration camps. One of the first things I noticed when I went in was that it was just incredibly quiet. And I thought, this is a monumental place. I knew about it and I'd seen photographs that had been taking place on the day of liberation, but still, it was so tomb-like and quiet and somber to walk in. And I heard that there was a legend that the birds never sing at Dachau, and because of the sadness there. And I called up my father, and I was starting to write the book, and I told him, I said, I heard that there's a legend that the birds never sing at Dachau. And his response was, after what I witnessed there, I don't blame him. So I thought, well, this has to be the title of the book, because they not only went there physically and geographically, they also went there emotionally. They got to a place where their lives were completely different for having witnessed that day in that place.
Thank you. The same person asks, are you familiar with Alex Kershaw's book, The Liberator, with Colonel Felix
Yeah, about
Sparks of
Felix
the
Sparks.
45th Infantry?
Mhm.
Was your father familiar with the Union?
Yes, yes, because my father and his because they were signal battalion, they would they would hook up with different infantry units through the war. So they were with the 101st Infantry. They at one point they were with the 45th. At one point, they were with the 42nd at one point, and the 45th and the 42nd both arrived at Dachau. Uh, you know, there's a competition. There's a little competition between who actually got there first, but
Oh, of course.
whoever got there first, they got there within 10 minutes of the other one,
Right.
probably because they were both there. And like I say, Dachau is not a little tiny place; it's a big place, so they both could have gotten there first. But my father, being with the signal battalion, they were with them, and so I think they were with the 45th that day. And so then they carried on from there. After Dachau, when they left, they went to Salzburg. They ended up with the 101st, and then they went up to the Eagle's Nest, Berchtesgaden, and those and places like that. But yeah, they were. He's familiar with that with those men because he was with them.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other audience questions, we might wrap up there.
I do want to mention that people, people can, if they're interested in getting a book, and I'm not here to sell a book, but I did write a book, but so if they're interested in getting the book, they can obviously get it on Amazon uh, and download it or get a hard copy or whatever. But if anybody would like an autographed copy, they can get that through my website. And I think you're probably going to have, yeah, you have a
I
link.
just entered it in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the link there, so they can actually get an autographed copy. Just say who would you like it autographed to, and I'll be happy to do that. It's an honor to do that.
Thank you. Um, Thank you, Mr. Seiko, for sharing your father's story with us today. Thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks again to our members. As a reminder, once you close out the session, there should be a short survey in your browser. We'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill that out. We put on several of these programs per week, so please feel free to tune in to the next one. You can find them at mohistory.org/events, and you can find all of our old programs on the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube page. So thanks, everyone. Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.